Have you ever wondered what happens when heaven goes silent? When the voice that once guided you suddenly stops speaking? Sometimes it's not punishment, it's preparation. God will often step back not because he's absent but because he's testing whether you can still trust him in the quiet. Remember Elijah in the cave? He didn't find God in the fire, the earthquake or the wind, but in the still small voice. And when that voice seems gone, it's not rejection, it's redirection. Archangel Michael's silence isn't about distance, it's about discernment. There's a reason he's not speaking right now, and it carries a message straight from the throne of heaven. And what I'm about to reveal to you about this could shift your perspective forever. But you must watch this video until the very end. There are moments in life when the silence of heaven feels heavier than any storm. You pray but there's no answer. You worship but the atmosphere feels still. You call out, yet it's as though your words vanish into the air. Has heaven stopped speaking? But the truth, dear friend, is far more mysterious and far more merciful. For sometimes, heaven grows quiet not out of anger, but out of grief, out of a love so deep it cannot compete with your noise. When you ignore conviction, when you silence that small inner stirring that whispers, "Don't go there. Don't say that, don't do this," you are not just turning away from morality, you are turning the dial away from the frequency of heaven. Conviction is not condemnation, it's communication. It is the gentle tapping of divine intelligence upon the door of your heart, trying to lead you back before you fall too far. But when you keep pushing it away, when you justify what you know is wrong, when you numb that sacred sensitivity, heaven respects your choice. The angels do not force entry. They wait outside the gates of your stubbornness, hoping you'll notice the silence and return. Consider Saul, the first king of Israel. There was a time he was chosen, anointed, filled with promise. Yet the moment he began to exalt his own will above divine instruction, the heavens grew distant, the prophet no longer came, the dreams ceased, even the Urim and Thummim, the holy instruments of guidance, were silent. Why? Because Saul kept ignoring the voice of conviction until all he could hear was himself. And that's the tragedy of many souls today. They confuse silence with absence when really, it's a boundary. Heaven doesn't keep speaking where obedience has stopped. We love to hear from God when it comforts us, but recoil when it confronts us. We want confirmation but not correction. We want blessings but not boundaries. Yet conviction is the compass of your soul. It's the quiet teacher that keeps your spirit aligned with purpose. The moment you start to ignore it, you lose direction. You start making decisions from impulse instead of inspiration. You begin walking roads that look right to the eyes, but lead to dead ends of the heart. Sometimes, heaven's silence is the echo of your own resistance. The angels aren't ignoring you, they're waiting for you to remember the last instruction you disobeyed. Because divine messengers don't waste words. They won't give you a new revelation while you're still rejecting the old one. That's why Archangel Michael says, "I will never talk to you if you keep ignoring the voice that has already been speaking within you." The celestial realm values alignment over noise, so maybe the silence you feel isn't punishment, it's precision. Maybe heaven is protecting you from more confusion by withholding what you're not ready to hear. Imagine a teacher who keeps giving a student new lessons while the last ones remain unlearned. It wouldn't make them wiser. Heaven pauses when your heart stops listening. You see, conviction is sacred dialogue. It's not there to shame you, it's there to shape you. Every time you ignore it, you desensitize yourself to the music of eternity. The song of the Spirit still plays, but your heart can no longer hear its melody. You become like a radio slightly out of tune, so close to the signal yet lost in static. But oh, when you return to that inner stillness, when you stop running from conviction and begin to sit with it, something begins to shift. You start to feel that whisper again. The subtle nudge. The soft warning. The warmth of grace rising like dawn after a long night of. That is heaven's mercy, reintroducing you to your own soul. So perhaps the silence you've been cursing was not God's rejection. It was his restraint. Perhaps he loved you too much to keep speaking over your noise. And when you finally choose to listen again, not with your ears but with your heart, the heavens open once more. Not with thunder, not with spectacle but with peace. The divine will never compete with your distractions, it will only wait for your surrender. And when you truly learn to listen again, when you honor conviction as the sacred compass it is, you will realize that heaven never stopped speaking at all. It was only waiting for you to be still enough to hear. The silence of God is not his absence, it is his invitation to return. There's a strange paradox in the human heart. We crave divine revelation, yet we resist divine responsibility. We want heaven to speak, but we often ignore the echo that says, "Obey what I already told you." We chase signs in the sky, but neglect the steps beneath our feet. We ask for angels to appear yet overlook the simple sacred act of obedience that would make their presence unnecessary. Many people spend their lives praying for direction, yet the map has already been drawn within. They are waiting for Archangel Michael to thunder a new message from the heavens while the last instruction lies untouched, gathering dust in the corners of their conscience. Heaven is not withholding revelation, it is waiting for obedience. Because divine communication is not entertainment, it is entrustment. The celestial realm only speaks where the heart is ready to act. Think of Abraham. He didn't receive a covenant in comfort, he received it in motion. He obeyed first, and understanding came later. That's the rhythm of heaven. God's messengers are drawn to movement, not stagnation. They speak to those who act, not those who endlessly ask. But when obedience dies, revelation goes quiet. It's easy to cry, "Lord, show me a sign," when the truth is that heaven has already spoken, and the only sign left to see is your surrender. You don't need another dream, another prophecy, another supernatural visitation. What you need is the courage to do what you already know. The divine doesn't give light to those who keep closing their eyes. When Archangel Michael says, "I will never talk to you if you keep seeking signs without obedience," it isn't a threat, it's spiritual law. Light only continues where it's followed. This is why so many souls wander in confusion. They move from message to message, channel to channel, always listening but never transforming. They think the silence means heaven has forgotten them, but silence often means the assignment hasn't changed. The last word you received still stands. The angel won't speak again until that word becomes flesh in your life. There is something profoundly humbling about obedience. It strips you of your desire for control. It asks you to trust the unseen. It teaches you that revelation is not meant to impress you but to instruct. And when you obey, something miraculous happens. You begin to hear the voice of heaven in places you never noticed before. You find it in the laughter of children, in the rhythm of rain, in the quiet between heartbeats. The whole world becomes alive with divine conversation because your soul has learned the language of obedience. But disobedience, even when wrapped in spiritual curiosity, builds distance. It's like asking for more light while refusing to open the curtain. Heaven cannot pour wisdom into a vessel that refuses to be still. Angels are not performers, they are messengers. And when the message is ignored, they retreat not in anger but in respect. They honor your freedom even when it leads you into silence. Sometimes the sign you've been praying for isn't coming because your life is the sign. Heaven is waiting for your actions to align with your prayers. You've been asking for confirmation, but God is asking for consistency. You've been seeking miracles, but heaven is seeking movement. Obedience is the soil where revelation takes root. Without it, no voice will grow into fruit. It's not that heaven is unwilling to speak, it's that you cannot hear new truth while resisting the old one. Spiritual deafness is not the absence of divine speech, it's the presence of selective listening. When you decide which commands to follow and which to ignore, you reduce the divine to a whisper you can control. But the sacred cannot be controlled, it must be obeyed. And here lies the beauty of it all. The moment you act on what you already know, the silence breaks. The stillness that once felt empty begins to pulse with presence. The guidance you thought you lost returns, not as a shout but as a steady guiding current beneath your spirit. Because heaven never stops speaking, it only waits for the heart to move in rhythm with what it has already said. Obedience is not the price of divine communication, it is the proof that you're ready to receive it. So if the angels have gone quiet, if heaven feels far, perhaps the message isn't lost at all. Perhaps it's simply paused, until you take the step you've been avoiding. The voice of heaven will always follow the feet that choose to move. Pride is a subtle thing. It rarely shouts its presence. It whispers in justification, cloaks itself in good intentions, and disguises arrogance as confidence. It begins small, just a thought that says I know better or I can handle this on my own. And slowly, without noticing, the heart begins to rise higher than heaven ever asked it to climb. Pride is not merely a moral flaw, it's a spiritual barrier. It fills the space where humility once allowed the divine to dwell. And when pride speaks too loudly, even angels go silent. There's a reason heaven doesn't dwell in the proud. It's not punishment, it's physics. Pride and divine presence cannot occupy the same atmosphere. One inflates the ego, the other dissolves it. Pride builds walls, humility opens windows. The moment you lift yourself above the voice of truth, you step out of resonance with the eternal. It's not that heaven has turned away, it's that you've elevated yourself beyond its frequency. Consider Lucifer, once the radiant morning star. His fall did not begin with rebellion, it began with comparison. He looked upon his own beauty and began to believe he was the source of it. That subtle shift, I am not just from the light, I am the light, was enough to fracture eternity. Pride blinded him from the truth that all brilliance, all wisdom, all power is borrowed from the one who gives it. And when he tried to speak as equal, heaven grew silent. It was not silence of punishment, it was silence of separation. The same silence still echoes through human heart. Every time we take credit for what grace accomplished, every time we boast of strength that mercy sustained, every time we forget the source of our light, we begin to drift toward that same stillness. The divine cannot speak through a vessel already full of its. Pride fills the cup with noise and heaven waits until it is emptied again. Humility is not weakness, it is open. It is not thinking less of yourself, it is simply remembering you are not the center. When you are humble, you become like an open field, vast, receptive, unguarded. The wind of the Spirit moves freely there. But pride fences the heart, placing boundaries where grace longs to flow. The proud demand explanation, the humble receive revelation. The proud say, I deserve to hear from heaven. The humble whisper, I'm grateful heaven ever chose to speak at all. There's a strange irony in spiritual life. The more certain you are that you've mastered it, the more lost you become. Pride thrives on spiritual success. It feeds on revelation, using divine insight as a mirror instead of a window. You begin to measure your growth, to compare your enlightenment, to count the signs and wonders as though heaven were keeping score. And in that moment, without realizing it, you cease to be a student and become an idol. You replace communion with performance, and the divine steps back quietly, gently, but firmly. Sometimes when heaven is silent, it's not because you've done something wrong, but because you've begun to think you can do everything right without help. The silence is a mirror. It shows you your dependence has failed. It asks you to return to the posture of wonder, the childlike openness that once made every whisper sacred. Because the moment you think you've earned revelation, you've already lost it. Humility is the language of heaven, it's the key that unlocks the still. When you bow in spirit, not out of shame but reverence, you realign yourself with divine rhythm. Then suddenly the quiet begins to speak again. Not as thunder, but as understanding. Not as command, but as communion. You see, pride isolates you from the harmony of existence. It makes you the center of a universe that was never meant to revolve around you. It blinds you to the truth that everything you are, every breath, every thought, every gift, is part of a vast symphony you did not compose. Humility, on the other hand, restores you to that symphony. It reminds you that you are both instrument and music, both echo and origin, both finite and eternal. And when you remember that, something softens inside you. The walls of self-importance crumble, the noise of striving fade. And in that stillness, you begin to hear again, not the voice of command, but the voice of communion. Heaven begins to speak, because the space has finally been made for it. The angels are not drawn to status, power, or intellect, they are drawn to surrender. They speak to the humble because humility sounds most like heaven. The proud build towers to reach God. The humble kneel, and find He was already there. You cannot call upon light while entertaining darkness, you cannot ask heaven to speak when you are still whispering to your The divine and the deceitful cannot share the same room within your soul. There is an order to the universe that cannot be violated. Light does not shout to be noticed, it simply shines. But if your eyes are fixed on the dark, you will not see it, not because it has left you, but because you have turned away. People often wonder why heaven grows quiet when they stray. They say, I've been praying but nothing answers. I've been asking but nothing moves. Yet they do not notice that their hands are holding what heaven cannot bless. You cannot keep what corrupts you and still expect to hear what cleanses you. You cannot live with divided loyalties and still walk in clarity. When Archangel Michael says, "I will never talk to you if you entertain darkness while asking for light," he is not condemning. He is describing a law of spiritual resonance. Heaven speaks in the language of purity, and you cannot tune into that frequency if your soul keeps harmonizing with deceit. Darkness does not always appear as evil. Sometimes it comes disguised as comfort. It shows up as the habit you refuse to break, the relationship you know drains you, the bitterness you nurture like an old friend. It's subtle. It convinces you that compromise is harmless, that a little shadow won't dim your faith. But every small accommodation of darkness dulls your inner vision. You start losing the sensitivity that once made you aware of the sacred. It's not that God has turned his back. It's that you've stopped facing him. Light requires honesty. It demands exposure. It cannot live in the places you keep locked away. That's why it feels uncomfortable when truth draws near. Because it reveals what you've learned to hide. But only what's revealed can be healed. When you choose to keep living in a duality, appearing righteous while harboring resentment, seeking guidance while refusing correction, you create interference. The divine voice becomes faint, not because it has diminished but because your attention has. There's an ancient story that captures this perfectly. A man stands before a lamp asking for illumination, but between him and the lamp is a veil. The lamp continues to burn brightly, but the veil filters its glow. He assumes the light has weakened when in truth it's his covering that blocks. So he keeps praying for more light while refusing to lift the veil. That veil is the darkness we choose to entertain, the compromise, the dishonesty, the small self-deceptions that make us comfortable in mediocrity. Darkness thrives in distraction. It wants you busy, reactive, scattered, so that you never pause long enough to notice its quiet control. But when you stop running, when you sit still and examine what you've allowed to linger, you begin to see how much of your silence is self-made. The angels are not absent. They are simply not invited to dwell in confusion. Light only fills the space that darkness releases. And yet here's the beautiful paradox. The moment you decide to let go of what dims you, the light doesn't have to travel far. It was always near. The second you stop feeding your shadows, illumination floods in naturally. It doesn't knock, it enters because it never truly left. The divine does not punish you for your darkness, it waits for your honesty. That's why purification is not about moral perfection, it's about alignment. It's about choosing truth again and again even when it exposes your flaws. The process of stepping into light isn't glamorous, it's raw, it's humbling. But it's there in the honesty of your surrender that heaven begins, not with thunder or spectacle but with that quiet certainty that tells you, you are still loved, but it's time to come clean. When you finally release the darkness, you realize it never really belonged to you, it only borrowed your energy, your attention, your feet. Once you reclaim those, the silence lifts, the air changes, the presence you thought was gone begins to breathe through your awareness once more. You begin to see that light was never outside you, it was obscured by what you refused to let. The angels of heaven are drawn to truth because truth and light are the same thing. They cannot communicate through pretense or hypocrisy. The divine speaks through transparency, through the soul that has nothing left to hide. If you want heaven to speak again, don't beg for more light, remove what blocks it. Because in the end the silence of heaven is not the absence of light but the shadow of your own refusal to face. There is a weight that many people carry, invisible but heavy enough to silence the voice of heaven. It is the weight of unforgiveness. You can pray, you can fast, you can sing hymns until your voice trembles, but if your heart is chained by resentment, you will always feel the distance of the divine. It isn't that heaven refuses to speak. It's that bitterness builds walls that even light cannot pass through. Forgiveness is not just a moral choice, it's a spiritual key. Without it, the door of revelation stays closed. We like to think of unforgiveness as a form of justice. We tell ourselves, I have a right to feel this way, they hurt me, they don't deserve peace. But here's the paradox, when you withhold forgiveness, you become the prisoner of the very pain you wish to escape. The person who wronged you moves on but the wound within you keeps bleeding. Every thought of them reopens it, Every prayer you pray filters through it, and slowly your spirit becomes clogged with old echoes, anger, betrayal, disappointment. It becomes hard to hear anything new because the frequency of heaven can't break through the noise of your bitterness. Forgiveness is not approval. It doesn't mean what happened was right. It means you've chosen not to let what happened define the rest of your journey. The act of forgiving is not about erasing the past, it's about reclaiming your future. Archangel Michael will never speak where the heart is barricaded by resentment. The energy of divine communication flows through love, and unforgiveness disrupts that current. You can't hold on to hurt and still hold space for revelation. Think of it like water trying to move through a blocked riverbed. The current is strong, constant, and pure, but if the stones of anger and pride are not removed, the water will pool and stagnate. Eventually, what once flowed freely becomes still and clouded. That is what unforgiveness does to the soul. It halts motion, it traps light. You stop growing, you stop sensing, and the silence you feel isn't heaven's abandonment, it's your own stillness frozen by pain. And yet forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Many believe it makes you weak, that it lets the offender win. But forgiveness doesn't excuse, it liberates. It breaks the illusion that someone else controls your peace. When you forgive, you are not freeing them. You are freeing yourself from the endless repetition of the wound. You are saying, I will not let this pain be my language anymore. There is an ancient wisdom in this. Love cannot flow where hate has built a home. The heart was designed to be a vessel of movement, joy in, pain out, grace in, growth out. The moment you trap bitterness, everything inside you begins to harden. You start seeing the world through the lens of what hurt you, rather than what can heal you. Even the whisper of heaven begins to sound distant, not because it's gone, but because you've closed your ears to anything that doesn't echo your pain. There's a story of a man who carried a stone in his pocket for every person who had wronged him. Each time he remembered the pain, he added another stone. One day he tried to run, but the weight of his own collection slowed him down until he could barely move. That's what unforgiveness does. It loads your spirit with stones of memory, until even blessings feel heavy. The divine cannot pour into a vessel that refuses to empty itself. When you forgive, you create space again. You clear the air between heaven and your soul. You let light move freely through the corridors of your heart. And suddenly silence becomes song again. The stillness you once feared now feels alive, breathing, warm. Because forgiveness doesn't just change how you feel, it changes how you hear. The frequency of love returns, and with it, clarity. There's something sacred about letting go, not because it's easy, but because it's honest. When you forgive, you declare that you trust divine justice more than your own. You surrender your right to revenge, and in doing so reclaim your right to peace. That's why angels are drawn to forgiveness. It mirrors heaven's nature. It's not a transaction, it's transformation. And when you finally release that burden, when you say, I choose to forgive even if they never apologize, you will notice something almost mystical. The silence that once felt like punishment begins to hum with presence. It's as though heaven was waiting for you to unclench your heart before it could speak again. The act of forgiveness is the act of rejoining the flow of divine energy. It is how you return to yourself, how you return to clarity, how you return to God. Heaven does not speak through bitterness, it speaks through peace. We live in an age where noise has become normal. Every moment hums with voices, some calling from screens, others whispering from memory, and still others echoing from our own fears. We are surrounded by advice, opinions, predictions, and interpretations, all clamoring for our attention. And somewhere in that endless orchestra of sound, the voice of heaven grows faint. Not because it has stopped speaking, but because it refuses to compete. The divine does not shout, it waits. There comes a time when the most spiritual thing you can do is turn down the volume of the world. Heaven will not speak through confusion, and Archangel Michael will not deliver a message into a mind filled with clamor. The sacred requires stillness, and stillness is an act of courage. To listen only to God in a world of endless noise is to swim against the current of distraction. But that's where the truth is found, not in the loud, but in the quiet. Think of Elijah on the mountain. The wind tore through the cliffs, the earth quaked, fire raged, but the divine voice was not in any of those grand displays. It came afterward in the still small whisper. It's always like that. When you are tuned to chaos, the whisper seems too small to matter. But when you silence everything else, it becomes the only thing you can hear. Heaven doesn't stop speaking, we simply forget how to listen. The tragedy of our age is not a lack of revelation, it's a lack of attention. We scroll, we seek, we rush from one teaching to another, one prophecy to the next, chasing new words because the old ones haven't yet taken root. We mistake movement for meaning. But the divine does not reward speed, it rewards stillness. When you are always reaching outward for answers, you forget that heaven's voice most often rises from within. Listening to everyone but God is like standing at a crossroads where every traveler gives you directions, yet none of them know your destination. The more voices you entertain, the less you recognize your own. You begin to mistake opinion for guidance, emotion for intuition, and popularity for truth. And when that happens, confusion becomes your teacher. You find yourself asking why heaven is silent, not realizing that you've filled the space where heaven once spoke. The angels of God do not deliver messages into minds already occupied. Revelation requires room, it demands that you be empty enough to receive. But we fear emptiness, we equate it with loss, loneliness, insignificance. Yet emptiness is sacred. It is not absence, it is readiness, it is the clearing of the clutter so the eternal can enter. There's something deeply transformative about solitude. Not isolation, but the kind of aloneness that allows you to hear your soul breathing again. When you sit quietly, when you stop running from the silence, you begin to notice that what you thought was emptiness is alive. There's movement in it, a gentle awareness, a living stillness. That is where heaven speaks. Not in the rush of thought, not in the noise of debate, but in that luminous pause between your breaths. Sometimes heaven's silence is an invitation. It says you've been listening to too many voices, come back to the source. It's a call to simplicity, to strip away the clutter of comparison and return to the center. When you finally stop seeking validation from every voice that passes by, you rediscover the one voice that never left you. The voice that does not flatter, does not demand, does not confuse. It simply speaks truth, and in that truth there is rest. To truly hear heaven, you must stop asking the world to interpret it for you. The divine voice it speaks in the language of your experience, your pain, your growth. No one else can translate it for you. This is why discernment begins in solitude. The less you seek outside, the more clearly you perceive inside. You don't need more noise to find direction, you need fewer distractions. You don't need another prophecy, you need peace, because clarity doesn't come from listening harder, it comes from listening deeper. The stillness is not empty, it's full of everything that truly matters. So perhaps the reason you haven't heard from heaven lately isn't because it's gone quiet. It's because you've been tuning into the wrong station. The divine doesn't speak over the chaos. It waits for you to remember the sound of your own spirit. When you stop chasing every voice, you finally begin to hear the one that was always speaking within. Heaven's silence is never punishment. It's a reminder to return to the stillness where your true guidance has always been waiting. Fear has a sound. You can't always hear it with your ears, but you can feel it in your bones. It hums beneath every anxious thought, every sleepless night, every moment you hesitate when faith asks you to move. It's the static that drowns out the voice of heaven. Fear narrows your perception until all you can see is danger, all you can feel is loss, and all you can imagine is what could go wrong. And in that small trembling space divine communication begins to fade. Not because heaven has withdrawn, but because fear has made no room for faith to breathe. Faith and fear cannot live in the same house. One opens the windows, the other bolts the doors. Fear is the great imitator. It pretends to protect you while secretly imprisoning you. It whispers, don't risk it, don't trust again, don't believe too deeply, and in doing so it silences the very guidance that would lead you to freedom. Heaven moves where faith lives because faith is the language of trust. It's not blind optimism, it's the quiet knowing that even in uncertainty the divine has not abandoned you. When Archangel Michael says, I will never talk to you if you've made fear louder than faith, it's not a rebuke, it's a revelation of spiritual law. Fear and faith are not just emotions, they are frequencies. The voice of heaven vibrates in the wavelength of trust. When fear takes over, your inner receiver changes. You begin tuning into survival instead of surrender, self-preservation instead of divine purpose. Heaven can only speak to the heart that believes it's still listening. Think of Peter on the water. For a moment faith carried him. He did what was impossible. He walked on the sea, eyes fixed on the light ahead. But then came the wind. The waves roared louder than the whisper that called him. His gaze shifted from promise to problem, and in that instant he sank, not because the water changed but because his focus did. That is how fear works. It doesn't need to destroy you, it only needs to distract you. Once your attention drifts from trust, your connection to heaven falters. Fear is cunning. It hides behind logic, disguises itself as caution, even wears the mask of wisdom. But real wisdom never paralyzes, it liberates. Fear confines. It shrinks the horizon of your possibility until you live inside the echo chamber of what feels safe. You stop praying boldly, stop dreaming deeply, stop expecting miracles. You begin to mistake stagnation for stability. And all the while heaven waits, not impatiently but silently, for you to remember how to trust again. Faith doesn't always remove fear, it simply speaks louder than it. Faith doesn't say, "There is nothing to be afraid of." It says, "There is something greater than what I fear." That's the shift that reopens the channel between heaven and the heart. The divine never requires you to be fearless, only willing. Willing to believe there's purpose in the uncertainty, willing to trust the unseen, willing to take the next step even when you can't see the whole path. Fear is a teacher, but it's not meant to be a home. It shows you where you still cling to control, where you've forgotten how to rest in the mystery. The moment you face your fear, not with aggression but with awareness, it begins to lose its hold. Because fear feeds on avoidance, it thrives in silence, in the dark corners of the mind that never see the light of faith. Bring it into the open and it dissolves like shadow at sunrise. And that's when the divine voice returns, quietly, not with fanfare or thunder but with a sense of peace so profound it feels like the world has exhaled. Fear cannot coexist with that peace, it trembles before it. Faith restores harmony where fear created. The silence breaks, not with sound but with understanding. You realize heaven never left, you were simply listening to the wrong sound. When you let faith grow louder than fear, everything begins to shift. The winds still blow, the storms still come, but their roar no longer defines you. You start to recognize that what you thought was chaos is often just the rhythm of your transformation. Heaven doesn't calm every storm. It teaches you how to walk through them. Fear makes you smaller but faith expands, and the divine speaks most clearly to those who have learned that expansion is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Heaven's silence is never punishment. It's an invitation to remember that the voice of God is never gone. It's simply waiting for your courage to rise to the. There is something sacred about silence, yet something terrifying about it too. The human heart is rarely comfortable in stillness. We crave noise, voices, movement, answers, signs, because silence feels like absence. But what if the silence of heaven isn't absence? What if it's presence in its purest form? A silence so deep that it humbles your thoughts, silences your ego and exposes what's truly inside you. When Archangel Michael says, "I will never talk to you if you refuse to be still," it's not a threat, it's a mirror. It's heaven reminding you that divine wisdom can't be poured into a vessel that's already overflowing with noise. Stillness is not inactivity, it's receptivity, it's the posture of listening beneath the surface of. The world trains us to respond, react, perform, to constantly fill every gap with sound, with words, with motion. But heaven speaks between the words, not within them. The divine voice doesn't compete for your attention, it waits for it. And that's why many never hear it. Not because heaven isn't speaking, but because they've never learned how to stop long enough to listen. Consider Moses. Before the fire burned upon the mountain, before the commandments, before the call, there was silence. 40 days of it, isolation in the wilderness. The kind of quiet that makes you confront yourself. In that silence the old identity dissolves and something new is born. Because when all external noise fades, you begin to hear the one sound that has always been there, the rhythm of your own soul in sync with something infinite. Most people are afraid of silence because in silence, they meet the unfiltered version of themselves. They realize how restless their minds are, how much they depend on distraction to avoid their own depth. But heaven doesn't reveal itself to the distract. You cannot carry divine understanding while clinging to the clutter of constant noise. The angels speak in frequencies that can only be detected in quiet awareness, in the still waters of a calm spirit. Silence is where the noise of fear, worry, and doubt begins to dissolve. It's where the illusion of separation fades and you begin to see how connected everything truly is. The trees breathe the same air you do. The stars shine with the same light that lives within you. Heaven doesn't need to shout because it knows it is already woven into everything that exists. The silence of heaven is not empty, it's full. It's overflowing with guidance, healing, and clarity that only become visible when the mind surrenders its need to control. But stillness requires trust. The moment you enter silence, your ego panics, because silence strips away every false layer of certainty. It brings you face to face with the vastness of what you don't know. And that's precisely where transformation begins. That's the place where faith is born, not from answers but from surrender. In stillness you begin to sense the subtle pull of divine rhythm. You start noticing patterns, the way certain people enter your life at the exact moment you need them, the way opportunities close to guide you toward something better, the way pain becomes the soil for revelation. None of these things can be seen when you're rushing, panicking, demanding to know what's next. Heaven often answers your prayers in the language of timing, not words. Stillness allows you to hear that language. The moment you stop chasing after messages and start becoming quiet enough to receive them, everything changes. The silence that once felt heavy begins to feel sacred. You realize that heaven was never far away. You begin to experience what mystics have always known, that stillness is not an escape from life, it's a return to it. It's the space where your will and the divine will finally align. The most profound revelations don't come in lightning or thunder. They come like a whisper through the wind, like a heartbeat in the dark, like peace settling over chaos. That's how heaven speaks, softly enough that only those who are truly listening can hear. And so when the angel says, "I will never talk to you if you refuse to be still," he's not withdrawing love. He's inviting alignment. He's calling you to quiet the storms within so you can hear what has been spoken all along. Because the truth is, heaven never stopped speaking, you just have to become still enough to remember how to listen. There comes a moment in every journey when the divine voice seems to fall silent, not because you've done something wrong, but because you're being invited to stand on your own. It's the quiet that follows instruction, the pause between promise and fulfillment. It feels like abandonment at first, but it is, in truth, empowering. When Archangel Michael says, "I will never talk to you if you won't act on what I've already said," he's speaking to a truth many of us resist. Revelation without movement becomes stagnation. Heaven doesn't waste words on those who won't walk. We often ask for guidance but not transformation. We want to know without becoming. We want to be told the next step, yet we hesitate to take it. And when heaven grows silent, we assume we've lost favor. But silence is sometimes heaven's way of saying, "I've already spoken, now move." The divine doesn't repeat itself, it waits for obedience to echo through your actions. The next message isn't given until the first one is lived. There is a deep wisdom in that design. Imagine being given a map with only the first turn illuminated. You wouldn't see the entire path, but if you trusted and walked, the next part would appear. That is how divine communication works. The revelation unfolds as you move. But when you refuse to act, the light stops shining ahead, not out of anger, but because there's no need to guide what refuses to walk. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness. They wandered for 40 years, not because the path was unclear but because their faith was incomplete. God had already spoken, the promise was theirs. But fear, doubt, and disobedience turned days into decades. Heaven doesn't speak new direction when old instructions remain unfulfilled. You cannot ask for a new word when you've ignored the last one. The human mind loves the comfort of delay. It says, "I'll move when I'm sure," but the soul evolves through movement, not certainty. Certainty is the illusion the ego craves. Trust is the reality the spirit requires. Faith is the courage to act even when you can't see the end from the beginning. The divine voice grows quieter, not because it's gone but because it's waiting for resonance. When your life begins to echo heaven's last instruction, the next one arrives effortlessly. Sometimes, obedience feels like walking into the dark. There's no confirmation, no sign, no reassurance. And yet something inside you knows, it's time. That quiet knowing is heaven speaking through intuition, through alignment, through the magnetic pull of purpose. You may not hear a voice, but you'll feel a direction. It's subtle but persistent, like the tide calling the shore. But when we resist that pull, when we stay in comfort rather than conviction, heaven grows silent, not in punishment, but in patience. The universe won't force movement, it honors free will. It lets you linger in lessons until you're ready to live them. Every delay, every repeated season, is simply life asking, will you finally walk in what you already know? There's something powerful that happens when you do. The silence breaks, not with thunder but with synchronicity. Doors open that logic can't explain. People appear who carry pieces of your next chapter. The world around you begins to respond to your obedience. It's as if heaven was always speaking, waiting for you to match its frequency through action. That's why faith isn't just a belief, it's participation in divine rhythm. The moment you step into alignment with what's already been revealed, you enter a flow where instruction becomes experience. You realize that God doesn't just want to tell you what to do, He wants you to become the message. You stop waiting for a sign because your life becomes one. And in that transformation, the voice returns, not as something external but as something within. You begin to see that the silence was never a void, it was an invitation. Heaven wasn't ignoring you, it was watching to see if you trusted enough to move. Once you do, the conversation resumes, deeper and clearer than ever before. This is the paradox of divine communication. The less you depend on hearing it, the more you begin to live it. The message and the messenger become one. The space between prayer and response dissolves. Life itself becomes the dialogue. So when you find yourself in a season where heaven seems quiet, ask not, why won't you speak to me? But have I done what you already said? Because sometimes the silence isn't punishment, it's a sacred pause between instruction and realization. Heaven doesn't withhold its voice, it simply waits for you to move in harmony with it. And when you finally do, you'll discover that the voice was never gone, it was waiting inside your obedience all along.